All right, good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining. This is Andy White. I will be your host this morning as we pick up where we left off last week with configuring IP phones. We'll continue the topic. This is session 2. This morning we are going to talk about phone firmware. We're going to look at remote phones, some of the options for configuring the remote phones, such as manual, a phone vendor redirect server, maybe OpenVPN. And this is the second part in a series of webinars that we'll be doing. Short webinars just focused on specific topics. All right, and this is the second session. We'll look at pick up from here. We'll go in a couple weeks. We'll look at the call routing table, configuring the SIP trunks, call scenarios, and auto tenant configuration and scenarios. And if you have any other ideas or suggestions or specific topics, let me know, and we'll see if we can tackle some of those for you. All right. As far as the agenda for this morning, I've allowed for about an hour session. We're going to look at some slides for showing the configuration options. I'm going to look at some documentation on the support portal, configuring the phones from the QX. We're going to look at the IP line settings again, the firmware updates on the phone, where you can get the latest firmware or our recommended firmware, using a VLAN, and also we're going to look at some remote phone options and some of the problems that are faced when you configure the remote phones. And then we're going to try to configure some phones using the remote phones using some of the methods, different type of methods, like manually configuring the phone, using the phone provisioning server, using the phone vendor's redirect server, and then also using OpenVPN. We'll try to configure a phone that way. And then later at the end, we're going to take time for, we'll have time for some questions. And we will try to make these available at some point. We'll get these available out there so people can view them. All right, some of the options on when you configure the phones to the system. There's numerous methods. Keep in mind that the system has a WAN as well as a LAN port, so it lends itself to a lot of flexibility. And combine that with some of the enhancements that we've done, you've got some nice options for being able to configuring the phones to the system. So this is probably a typical installation. The customer's got a broadband connection, they got a firewall in place, they got a DHCP server, they got their computers. So you come in with the system, connect the WAN port to you can connect it to that same switch, and those phones that can be configured through through their local network into the QX, the WAN port. A second scenario, similar to the first, is physically everything's the same, but there's a VLAN that's created where you can put the phones in a VLAN, and the QX is going to have a second IP address on that WAN port, and it can act as the DHCP server across the VLANs. And this works real well because it keeps your voice traffic separate from your computer traffic, your data traffic. All right. Another option would be you still have the same broadband connection coming in. They got the firewall in place. They've got a switch. You can still connect the QX WAN port to that network. That way the QX can get outside access to the out through the internet, can get out to the SIP trunks, can get out send it for applications like email. But notice the placement of the phones this time. That they're out on the on a separate switch. They're on their own network on the LAN of the QX. The QX will act as a DHCP server. That's the easiest method for configuring the phones because the system phones are recognized right away as soon as they boot up. We recognize the phones and give them an IP address, and they configure real easily that way. All right. Another method is you can have remote phones physically located at another building, another office, same city, different, it could be a different city, different state even, but they're remotely located, and those phones are behind a firewall. The site has its own broadband connection, its own firewall in place, and the phones are on the private network. So that is the challenge, okay? Because that firewall at that location is there to do a job, and that job is to not let any outside traffic or anybody from the external internet to be able to access those devices, including the phones, which poses a problem when you're trying to do voice over IP, and you've got your messaging for which is your SIP messaging to establish the calls, and then you got your voice, which is the RTP ports, and those ports are naturally they're closed by default on that firewall, so they've got to either be manually opened or maybe use some other technique. All right, we'll talk about that a little bit more. All right, Epygi has, over the years, we've worked with many partners, integrated the QX and tested with many solutions, many different products. Of course, everybody knows that we've got a tight integration with all the IP phone vendors out there. But we've also, the system can be easily work with or configured with any of the devices that have a SIP client on them, whether it be door stations or video cameras or paging adapters. All these different devices, they will work in software solutions for faxing and things like that. But it will all work with the PBX, and we'll show you how to configure some of those. All right, when the phones are configured locally to the QX, we talked last week about the different methods. You've got the plug and play, where you can connect the phone to the QX, and the phone will just automatically come up. It automatically gets configured. We recognize the phone, and we will assign it an IP line along with an extension, and it just kind of happens without you having to do anything at all to bring that phone or configure it. All right, there's also the auto configuration, which is where you go in, you specifically select an IP line in the system along with the extension assigned to that IP line, and then you specify the phone model, the vendor, they enter the MAC address to the IP line, and then you connect the phone, and it will be assigned to the IP line that you assigned it to or configured it to. All right, then there's a manual method, and that's for a lot of those other devices like door stations and video cameras and things like that. And you're going to manually configure the settings on the QX as well as the settings on the device itself. All right, when it comes to remote phones, you got some other options. We can use auto configuration, where the NATing issues are resolved by use of the symmetric RTP option. Then you've got the on the QX, you enter the phone model and the MAC address, and then you log into the phone and set the provisioning server to be the IP address or the host of the PBX. All right, the phone will boot up and it will reach out to the QX, and we're going to present it, we're going to give it a configuration file. All right, there's also auto configuration using an OpenVPN, where the NATing issues are resolved by a VPN connection between the phone and the ECQX. You also get an added benefit where you get a secure connection between the two, and it also allows for a phone connection or a connection to the phone GUI if your PC also has that same OpenVPN connection. So in this case, on the QX, we're going to configure the OpenVPN server. We generate the OpenVPN configuration file that's going to be used on the phone. And then we enter, just like we normally would, we go to the IP line settings where we enter the phone model, the MAC address, and select the OpenVPN settings option. Then then you go out to the phone, and then you have to install the OpenVPN config file on the phone itself. And it's a small file, and it only takes a moment. And then you set the provisioning server just as you normally would. And the phone will reach out to the QX to its IP, and then it will be configured that way. All right, we're going to try to show a couple of these methods, including the OpenVPN. So we'll see how that goes. All right, the next option will be to manually configure the phone using the remotely using the where you have to manually put in the settings into the device. The username, password, you enter the same on the QX, and then you go into the phone and you enter the same information. Okay. All right, and so you can manually configure the phone. All right, another method is going to be using zero-touch provisioning. Okay, so this is a method where you go out and you configure all the phone vendors. Sorry, I'm just having problems with my mouse here, so trying to get it working. All right, we're all set. So zero-touch provisioning using the redirect provisioning server on the from the phone vendor. So by default, when the phone powers up, it's going to look to the phone vendor manufacturer's their provisioning server, and it's going to in that provisioning server will be the MAC address, and that MAC address will be recognized, and there'll be a basically the phone's going to be redirected to where the PBX is so that it can request the configuration file. So on the RPS server, you enter the MAC address of the phone and then the IP address where the PBX is located, or the host name. And then on the phone, when it boots up, it goes out, contacts that RPS server, and it will receive the URL of where the PBX is located, and they'll go out and contact the PBX and request the config file. So we've tested this with Snome, Yealink, and Fanvilles, and they're all working quite well. All right. So we'll come back. That's it for the slides for now. Okay, in the support portal, and by the way, we've launched our new website. We've completely redone the website. Has a new look to it, new feel, a lot of updates, and actually we're still working on it. There's still a few things that we need to fix, but it's looking real good. So we're real pleased with the new design. All right, so we'll take a moment when you get a chance, go back to our website and take a look at it. So we want to look at the support portal just real quickly. Log in with your email account. A couple of documents that we're going to be referencing. You've got if you search for IP space phones, there's several documents to view, so just as a reminder. All right, last week we talked about, we looked at a couple of these, configuring the Epygi supported IP phones. This will talk about how to configure the device when when you're using a third-party server. The one below it is configuring the features on the Epygi supported phones. Talks about all the different options available across all the phones, and also how to be able to do some of the features like conferencing and things like that, and transfers. All right, then there's the auto configuration of Epygi supported phones, IP phones, using OpenVPN, and we're going to look at that today. So there's several documents here, including the software release notes, which actually I'd like to take a look at. I do have those opened already, so let's just, as a refresher, let's go back and just look at this briefly. So in the software release notes, again, you'll have the, we often get asked, which phones do we support, or which phones are recommended? Well, the software release notes is going to have the most up-to-date list of phones, the phone vendor, the model, the preferred software version. All right, which is important. Okay, always go back to that. If you're having problems, you may need to maybe even downgrade that phone to our recommended firmware. Okay, I ran across that just yesterday with a Grandstream phone. They've made some changes in their latest firmware. So you get a new phone, it has some of the newer firmware on it, and sure enough, there's a few things that weren't working on that phone, such as being able to do like an auto reboot of the phone from the PBX. All right, so they've made some changes, some security enhancements. Well, that has broken some of the methods that we use. Okay, so when we come to that firmware release, we're going to have to get it updated, tested, and get and work through that as well. So that's why we always recommend the firmware versions that you see here. Okay, some check with the phone manufacturer. Most of them can be downgraded if needed, or the recommended firmware can be installed easily. An exception to that is Fanville. I don't recommend downgrading those Fanville phones. It could brick the phone. All right. So let's take a look. Let's go into I'm going to log into a QX. This is a local QX 200. If you need the latest, or if you need a recommended firmware, okay, you can get that really right from within the PBX. If you go to the hidden menu, it's called IP phones. Don't forget there's two P's there. IP phones, FRM, short for firmware. FRM, IP phones, FRM.CGI. You have to type that in. It's one of the hidden menus. Keep in mind there is a document out there on some of these menu pages if you need it, but there's not that many of them that you'd want to access. But this is a useful one. So you can go and you can find that particular phone model. For example, the GXP 2170. Our recommended firmware is 1.0.7.99, and here's a link. Okay, you can just copy that link and you can paste it directly into your browser, and you can see it's now downloading. At the bottom of my page, it's downloading, and it will be put into my folder for my downloads. Okay, so now I've got that firmware version, and let's just take a quick look at it. All right, so now it's in my downloads, GXP 21770 firmware, and then the version that we downloaded. Okay, so just keep that in mind. Okay, we're looking at configuring the IP phones. Again, you've got your extensions. Your extensions get assigned to your IP lines, and then you go to your IP line settings. This is where all of your options are. Go to the IP lines, and then you've got your three methods. The auto, the plug and play, the auto config, and the manual method. All right, and then we mentioned in the IP line settings, you have to specify where the phone is going to be located physically in reference to the QX, whether it's going to be on the LAN, WAN, or you can see now I've got a new option here called VLAN. Okay, so going back to that slide that I mentioned earlier, if you want to create a VLAN, you can do so. So to do that, you go to Network. I created this yesterday, so actually it's already here. We won't have to create it. But you go in and let's just do an edit on this setting. So you go to the VLAN settings, and you can specify whether the VLAN is going to be on the LAN or WAN of the QX, the VLAN ID that it's going to be using, and then you have the IP address that the QX WAN port is going to have within that VLAN. In this case, it's going to be 10.0.1.1. All right, and subnet mask, and then the largest MTU size. Okay, so once you create that VLAN, then you could go to your DHCP settings, and on the DHCP settings, there's an option here at the top that says DHCP before VLAN, and then you can enable that, and we're going to hand out the IP addresses in the range of .1.2, 10.0.1.2, all the way to 10.0.1.254.